And peace talks are underway between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators right now as we speak. In fact, delegations from both the warring nations are right now in Istanbul for their first face-to-face talks in more than 2 weeks. And the talks are aimed at trying to end a war that has killed an estimated 20,000 people so far and also forced more than 10 million to leave their homes. Let me go across to Maroof Raza, strategic affairs expert, joining us on this broadcast, and also a very big story that we are tracking on Mirror now. Maroof, coming straight to point, the delegations of both the nations are at a neutral location right now, that is Turkey. But how much hope should we pin to this entire development, these negotiations, whether these talks are going to yield anything at all, because there is no ceasefire on ground? Or can we expect that ceasefire could actually be a byproduct of these negotiations?
Well, that's a good question, but I think in the last month plus, now the peace talks leave certain room for optimism for the following reasons. One is that Ukraine is willing to soften its stand, and so is Russia. I think there's realization in Moscow that their military operations haven't gone as expected. They were quite optimistic they would roll across Ukraine and be greeted there as victors to come and so-called liberate Ukraine. That has been exactly the opposite. There's been a tough resistance put on, and Ukraine in itself was also hopeful of NATO coming in physically to support them, other than providing money and arms. In both cases, these calculations haven't gone right. So what we are left with is a situation where Russia is now toning down its posture and is willing to settle for a minimalist position, which means the lands it has occupied along the Russia-Ukraine border and the Donbas region, and it becomes part of an autonomous region under Russian control and gives Russia the kind of physical buffer against Ukraine, which may eventually, in Russian expectations, become a physical member of NATO and therefore have NATO forces glaring down at Russia, which is what NATO was trying to do from 2008 onwards. That is something Russia has now been able to more or less address, unfortunately at a very high cost. And Ukraine has now come around to making admissions that Ukraine is not going to be able to become a member of NATO, and therefore what can Ukraine expect? A lot of encouragement from the sidelines, support in terms of arms and medical and other assistance and money, but at the end of the day, I don't think it has been worth the price for Ukraine to have gone along with America and Western-led expectations that NATO would support them, because the cost has been very high for Ukraine.
Right.
Eventually, I think there will be a settlement, not on these rounds of talks, but maybe very quickly in the next week or two, where Russia will be willing to call it a day if there are guarantees given about Ukraine's neutrality and Russia being allowed to hold on to the territory it has captured. Otherwise, it can be a war that can go on for months, if not years. As far as Ukraine is concerned, Ukraine would be lucky to get away with its system intact, though at a huge cost, and the cost will be borne by NATO and other European friends of Ukraine. But you can't bring back the thousands of lives that were lost. But at the end of the day, I think that is going to be the middle path that Russia and Ukraine will settle for, and that is what these talks are leading to. Any negotiations during a conflict or a war, both sides start off with their extended expectations, which means they propose the furthermost they can hope to get, and gradually these talks allow you to tone it down and come around to a level where both sides can then have reasonable face saving. The gainer, to my mind, has been America and Western Europe, which has had to provide a lot of arms and weapons. But for this, money will be made available and the arms industry in America will benefit.
Right.
And America and Western Europe will need to go back to the drawing board and decide the future of Europe and where the dividing lines between Europe and Russia-led East Europe will fall.
Right.
That
Also,
is going to be the final outcome.
right. Maroof, you spoke about the posturing by both the nations before these talks and, in fact, during the course of this time. In the build-up of these talks, it was interesting to see how Zelensky's stance also changed from being a bit accommodative to then stern again. He spoke about a possible compromise few days back as far as rebel-controlled Donbass is concerned. But then yesterday, again, he reiterated that territorial integrity is something which is paramount for Ukraine. Is this going to have any kind of bearing on the negotiations?
You know, every time historically, and I can only speak with the sense of history, that negotiations take place during battle. I said so from the very beginning that while the conflict is on, negotiations will happen on the sidelines. And in such negotiations, both parties try worst case scenarios and best case scenarios to see who gives in. The Chinese are best at that. They sit poker faced and never tell you what they are really looking at. And at the end of the day, they go away from leaving you confused. In this case, the battle lines are very clearly drawn. And I think Mr. Zelensky cannot completely buckle down, having put up a great front. And as far as Russia is concerned, you know, Putin cannot be seen to be backing out because that will be the end of his regime in Moscow. So there is a lot more at stake than what is on the battlefield. And I think the next 1 week or 10 days is going to define for us where things are going to go.
Right. Also, Maroof, I also wanted to speak a little about role of Turkey and how the president of Turkey is actively trying to position himself as a potential peace broker between Russia and Ukraine. Why do you think is that so, especially at a time when the world is clearly divided into two parts?
Well, Mr. Erdogan is an unusual man. He has stood up to a lot of challenges in domestic politics. He has also stood up to the arrogant ways of European Union and NATO, where they were willing to accept all sorts of countries into European Union, but not Turkey, because Turkey is largely a Muslim country. So he said, to hell with the European Union, and I will go my own way and revive the Turkish Caliphate, which was the most powerful entity in West Asia and the Arab world. Even Saudi Arabia was a part of it. Now, what he's trying to do is he's trying to emerge as a personality of greater significance than all these other leaders in the West who have very clearly taken a stance one way or the other. His advantages are that he's a member of NATO. At the same time, he has also got strong connections with the Balkan region and with the Russians. Both parties find him half acceptable, if not fully acceptable. Also, Turkey's coastline is around the Black Sea area, which is also a sea that shares a coastline with Ukraine and Russia. Russia has a very powerful Black Sea fleet, but they're all held subject to Turkey giving them permission to use the Straits of Dardanelles to go across into the Mediterranean. So Turkey holds a lot of military, political, and strategic advantages vis-a-vis any other country. I would have thought that France could have played a similar role, but for whatever reason, the French president, probably more preoccupied with forthcoming elections, did not take this role. Somebody had to play the role who would be acceptable to both sides. And I think Turkey has done that, and Turkey is going to come out of it strategically a winner as against anybody else.
Right, Maroof Raza, thank you so much for speaking to us. Of course, updates are coming in right now as we speak. Negotiations are underway between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul. We are tracking all the developments that are taking place right now in Istanbul and also back in Ukraine. Some breaking updates also coming in. And Ukraine has said that it is restarting evacuations after pause over Russian provocation. So this is also one significant development that is taking place, where Ukraine has claimed that it is going to restart evacuations, basically going to open up those humanitarian corridors corridors that we always speak about after pause over Russian provocations, though they haven't explicitly said what exactly did they mean when they say that Russian provocations have paused for now, but they have said, Ukraine has said that they are going to restart evacuations when it comes to civilians.